introduction, really, Melinda French Gates, who is the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're delighted to have you with us in person this year. Forrest Whitaker, of course, the founder and CEO of the Whitaker Peace and Development Initiative. Likewise, delighted to have you in person with us this year. Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation. Thank you for being with us. And we're also joined down the line by the Lord Mayor of Kampala in Uganda, Erias Lukwago. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Melinda French Gates, I'd like to begin with you. It is, of course, now that we try and look again at how we're going to rebuild the world post-pandemic and all the economic crisis that has followed, there are some that are at risk of getting left behind.
Yes, I mean, we've seen with this crisis, that 30 years of progress that was made against fighting poverty, maternal health, so many different preventable diseases, a lot of that is at risk of being set back. And yet, I think you're going to hear from some of the other speakers on the panel, too, about progress that can be made. But I think what we have to really look at is the inequity of this crisis. It has really hit the impoverished the most and people at the margins. And particularly that has meant women. We have to look at what the pandemic has done to women's jobs. 64 million women lost their jobs during this pandemic, and they're at risk, many of them, of never going back. Men, it looks like by the end of this year, will have regained all their jobs since 2019, but women are set to lose another 2 million jobs. And a lot of that, we believe, has to do with the caregiving that women are doing at home. For every 2 extra hours of caregiving, you get 10% less labor force participation. So there are things that we can do about that, though. It was great that President Macron hosted the Generation Equality Forum back in June. I was pleased to be there as well with so many partners who committed billions of dollars in energy to working on women's issues. The foundation thinks about working in women's issues in really 3 areas. We call them cash, that is putting money in women's hands, particularly through a digital mobile phone, which there are many millions of those around the world, and many countries even in all over Africa these days. We think of it as caregiving, really working on the caregiving system so women have a place to leave their children or the elderly. There are things we can do, policies to help with that. And then also data, really collecting data about women's lives so we know where to make investments and whether they're coming back into the economy. So it's not just our foundation, it's many partners and governments doing that work, but we really need to focus on women if we're going to have a full and complete recovery.
Because as you suggest, a crisis is also an opportunity. Forrest Whitaker, your initiative has been very much involved on the ground for many years now with some of those most underserved communities. You got involved right at the start of the pandemic.
I mean, it's interesting because we've trained the youth to be conflict resolutionists and social entrepreneurs. So they had a certain methodology that they would live with, that they've been using for the years. And when the pandemic started to happen, there was an activation by the youth that they wanted to be able to contribute and to figure out what to do. So they took their understanding of businesses and social entrepreneurships and started to create businesses that would help them build masks for the youth. They built about 75,000 masks doing that. They decided to educate the population, so they started to use their sort of town hall meeting systems to be able to talk and to educate the community. With maybe upwards to 350,000 people were contacted by them. They tried to also develop what they call a tippy-tap system, or a way for people to be able to wash their hands and deal with sanitary issues. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that they were able to apply themselves to help this situation, and I think that grows all the way around. I mean, all of us know that this pandemic has affected everyone in the world. I think there's no question in the U.S., of course, there's been like 750,000 deaths. I mean, that equates to almost a fifth of the amount of people that have died from this virus. But I think one of the people that are most overlooked, I think, too, are the youths, and as she said, as the women. And I think the youths, look, there's about 42% of the people on this planet are under the age of 25 years old. Oh. So 90% of those people live in areas of conflict or disadvantaged developing nations. And about 600,000 of these people, of these youths, live in areas of conflict. So you try to figure out how you can affect them because they're going to be the turning point to help us be able to rebuild after this situation goes on and during the situation that's going on.
The most important to help, and first and foremost, and Darren Walker, that's what you've been talking about as well, the importance of, for a start, even before we move on to rebuilding communities, and those, as far as Whitaker was just saying, who were perhaps hardest to reach before and even more impacted now, there's the question of vaccine equity, and that's something you've been working on.
Absolutely, and it's such an honor to be on this stage with, of course, Melinda Frente-Gates, whose singular leadership and impact on women and girls is absolutely remarkable. And Forrest, your work at conflict resolution with young people from Los Angeles to Harlem to South Sudan is so inspiring. I think that question is so relevant in this moment because COVID has manifested the reality of global inequality profoundly. And it is going to require moral leadership for this moral imperative of how do we reduce the inequality between and within countries and regions. And in order to do that, we are going to have moral leadership. And what does moral leadership look like around this conundrum of vaccine inequity? Moral leadership looks like financing in new ways. It is going to require multilaterals to be more creative and to understand that the debt burden on countries in the global south is suffocating them. And until we can finance and provide the financing for the vaccines, we are not going to see progress, and that financing is going to need to come from the United States, the EU, the G7, and that is going to demand more. I think moral leadership is going to require that our large pharmaceutical companies be engaged in different ways. And we have seen pharmaceutical companies step up. This happened, of course, during the AIDS and HIV crisis, which, of course, the Gates Foundation was a leader in helping to resolve around the antiretroviral and PEPFAR. We're going to need that kind of a response here. We're going to need to reconsider the IP regime that prevents production of much-needed vaccines in countries where there is production capacity. There is production capacity in India, in South Africa, that can be unleashed. It was a shame that some of the earliest production in South Africa of vaccines went to Europe, not to Africa. And finally, we're going to have to think about the distribution within country. So just transferring vaccines and financing them into health systems that are not equitable and that do not serve all the citizenry is only going to reify at a local level inequality that is very stark and profound.
What you're saying is that it is forcing a rethink about almost everything. I'd like to put that to our fourth panelist who joins us sadly from a distance, Arias Lukwago, who is the Lord Mayor of Kampala. I'd love your thoughts on the very concrete steps that you've been taking, working with other mayors around the world to try and bring a coordinated pandemic response. What have been the difficulties and what have you found?
First and foremost, I'm pleased to be part of this wonderful discourse and to represent the views of various mayors under the auspices of the Mayors Migration Council, who are working around the clock to ensure that no one is left behind in this struggle to confront this global pandemic. And I thank you very much to host me and also for the wonderful views that are being raised. No doubt, this pandemic has hit the cities the worst. Of course, looking at the statistics, which are yet to be verified, close to 95% of the victims, the cases, you'll find them in the cities, but our capacities are limited and we have inadequate resources. Even when it comes to vaccines, for example, right now we are still struggling in cities as leaders. We are struggling to see how we can mobilize people to participate in this and so on and so forth. But under the aegis of the Mayors Migration Council, with the support of Open Society Foundations and other UN agencies, at least we came up with the Global Fund Global Cities Fund for Inclusive Pandemic Response, so that we make sure that no one is left behind. And this one largely focuses on support to be given to the marginalized communities like the refugees and the migrants and the internally displaced people. You realize many of these people live in cities here, but no government programs, serious government programs have made provision for them. And they are left to the vagaries of nature, the vicissitudes of nature, and it's these collective efforts under the aegis of the Mayors Migration Council that have helped us to come up with some steps to be taken. And with the support of some UN agencies, we have at least mobilized some resources to give direct cash transfers and where possible to give some relief, food relief, and so on and so forth. But the demand is really too much. So if we are to ensure that no one is left behind in this global response to the pandemic, we must have this collective effort. We must have all these networks. We must have all these engagements and synergy to ensure that we pull the resources together to deal with this pandemic and ensure that we focus so much on these marginalized communities, the migrants and the refugees.
Lord Mayor, we'll come back to that in a moment. I think, Melinda, that's a really interesting point. There are all these efforts being made for those most forgotten, of course, the world's refugees, for those parts of the world where it is hardest. And yet, what we are seeing is, despite this rethink we've all been talking about, and I think we can all agree has been forced upon the world by what's happened, we are seeing parts of the world power ahead with an economic recovery that is kicking off and impressive, and another part of the world that is being left behind.
And I think we really need to look at that, because this pandemic has not hit countries equally. And so if we're really going to build back in a way that benefits everybody, we have to say, okay, what are the tools that the high-income countries have to bring to bear? Well, they're creating stimulus, using their financial tools to put a lot of stimulus into their economies to help people with things like caregiving, keeping their jobs. But the low-income countries don't have those same financial tools to use. So one of the things that the International Monetary Fund has done is opened up $650 billion worth of what we call special drawing rights. And what the G7 leaders have committed to is to taking 100 billion of those drawing rights from their high-income countries and making sure they're given to low-income countries. But they actually need to fulfill that. So President Macron has made sure that 20% of France's special drawing rights will go to low-income countries. I'm calling on other G7 leaders to make sure they do the same thing, so that low-income countries can use financial stimulus to make sure they have a good, strong, robust, equitable recovery. So it's not just, we absolutely have to get vaccines to them, we absolutely have to use the youth and the women of the country who will get messages out, but we also need to make sure that low-income countries can fully get their economies back up and running as quickly as possible.
So there is, Forrest Whitaker, this need for the wealthiest to help those who have not yet been able to have that recovery, to make it happen themselves. And then there's a question of what specific projects can be brought to those who've traditionally been underserved, whether it's in the wealthiest countries or not. How to bring those actual projects, and it's about entrepreneurship. This is what your initiative has been focused on for the last many years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for people to put into people's hands the skill sets to be able to help build a nation. They need to be considered as partners inside of that equation, and from that they can develop all kinds of things that help their communities and because looking at communities or looking at cities selectively, you find that there's a lot of opportunity for growth, and that the youths have been neglected in those communities. And once you start to actually engage them with the opportunities, which does take some stimulus, to be able to create businesses, then you have a whole new equation built up, and you have a whole rebuilding, not just from this situation, but a rebuilding of the world as it needs to be built upon, which is equality. I mean, I think when he's talking about vaccines, I mean, I know that in my own country, I had the disproportionate amount of people of color were ignored, and a lot of people were harmed because of that. And I think that we have to make sure that we apply this sort of communal environment towards the rest of the world and make sure that they have the right vaccines, and that they also look at their power base, which is the youth that'll be taking over, because they are people who have their foot in today and their feet into tomorrow. So we have to work with that to be able to make it work.
And Darren Walker, precisely that, the idea that the way we had to suddenly look at vaccines again also applies to other public goods, that, as Forrest Whitaker was just suggesting, we've been forced to have a rethink, but also to look again at those who need the most help, but also at how we handle what should belong to humanity.
Indeed, and I want to pick up on something Melinda said, which is very important. The SDRs are not going to flow into these countries naturally. There is going to have to be a mobilization to ensure that those allocations actually flow to the countries. And so we have to hold the G7 countries and our own country that we love, the United States of America, to account for that system and deliver it. And we have to also acknowledge that there are inequalities in the financing system itself. So let's not just isolate the situation with vaccines financing. The larger system of financing has unequal impacts, and it is designed in a way that it seems to continue to repeat these patterns of debt that ultimately are unsustainable for many of these countries in the global south. And as Melinda said, in the United States, we had huge incentives and huge monetary policy to stimulate our economies. We need to stimulate economies in the global south using some of those same mechanisms, and we haven't been willing to do that. And until we're willing to do that, the dignity that we all believe, each of our institutions is committed to a very fundamental idea that every person on the planet deserves to live with dignity. They cannot live with dignity if their countries are suffocating in debt, and hopelessness and despair is the national character.
Mayor Lukwago, I wonder if as the mayor of Kampala, for instance, you've begun to see a difference in what you're seeing in terms of solidarity from the rest of the world, not just on vaccines, but also on economic recovery.
The network is not clear?
No, we have bad lines. I wondered if, as a result of the pandemic, you were seeing enough of the sort of help that you need, and what more the world needs to be doing for countries like Uganda.
Well, what is important and what is critical right now, what my brothers talked about, bridging that inequality when it comes to vaccination. Here in Kampala, and I'm speaking maybe on behalf of the entire African continent, save a few like South Africa and others, we are doing badly in terms of vaccination. And apart from vaccine hesitance, we don't have even the vaccines themselves. If I were to show you pictures of the long queues here for people lining up for the single dose, for the first dose, you will be shocked, you will be amazed. It's really very, very pathetic and dire. I think global platforms like Paris Peace Forum, and of course now the Global Cities Fund on inclusive response to the pandemic, need to expand their scope and bring in this element, like he has mentioned, the global south to be catered for when it comes to vaccination. It's quite important. I appreciate, like, for example, the recently concluded the COP26, the Global Cities Fund on inclusive response was widened to include climate change action. We can also bring in that element of mass vaccination to be done in less privileged countries, cities. And for us, we are ready to do the work. We are ready partners here. We can mobilize the people. We can deal with all what is necessary. But let me tell you, it's dire when it comes down here. For example, I'll tell you, in Uganda here, we are talking of opening up the economy now. We are still under lockdown. The schools are not open. UNESCO said all the schools should be open, but in Uganda here, over 2 years now, the schools are still closed. And we have 15 million learners, for example, but we are yet even to vaccinate a quarter of the 15 million learners because the vaccines are not there. Now you can imagine the whole generation is gone, no education, no what. And when it comes to other marginalized groups like the migrants, the refugees who have no legal status, the situation is even worse. So what we need to do going forward, the interventions made by those global platforms so that we build the synergy and ensure that we pull our resources together, we get all the efforts together and see that we can come up with those drives that can ensure vaccination reaching out to even these other groups.
Melinda French-Gates, Mayor Lukwago makes an excellent point. There is not only the need for a global rethink, as we've been discussing, but then so much time that will need to be made up for the importance of education, for instance, all of those who've been deprived of it. How hopeful are you that this shock has been so profound that the world is ready to reinvent the way that it functions?
Well, I think we are seeing some reinvents. I mean, this is the first time we've had a vaccine, other than the Ebola vaccine, that didn't have to go out widely in less than 300 days. I mean, that's unbelievable. We can use some of that technology for other diseases, preventable diseases like malaria that affects a lot of the global south, eventually tuberculosis and HIV. But what we're at risk of doing is having the high-income countries like the United States or like Europe say, oh, goodness, we've got the pandemic kind of behind us a year from now, and let's move on. But the world can't move on until everybody in Kampala has a vaccine that needs one, until everybody in South Africa that needs a vaccine has one and has 2 doses. We can't move on. But we need to use what we have. We have these great digital tools. We are seeing that kids are being able to be educated somewhat via their computers. But wow, we're at risk of having 10 million kids never go back to school. So it is imperative, it's a moral imperative that the wealthier countries make sure that the global south has a full economic recovery.
Darren,
it's good for the world.
Darren Walker, perhaps to you, that idea that until all of us are able to move on, none of us can really move on.
Indeed. I mean, I think just listening to the mayor, children in his city have not gone to school for 2 years. And Melinda, you certainly know from the work of the Gates Foundation what the impact on children's learning is when that happens. So I agree, this is a moral imperative, but I am hopeful. I am actually hopeful because I think the world for the first time understands what real inequality looks like and the pernicious harm that ultimately harms us all, including those of us in the United States and the North. I'm hopeful because I see leaders like President Macron, like my own president, who I think is attempting to be courageous in the face of a lot of headwinds. It is not easy to be a moral, courageous leader today. Often our leaders are not incented to be courageous, to take risks, to think beyond their own borders, to see themselves and their nations as part of a global community and therefore have an obligation. In the United States, this is something that we have certainly held dear as an ethic, a value. And so we now are being called to do more, to return to those values of grace and generosity and dignity and operating from a position of those values. If we do not, the global north will fail the south and will ultimately fail ourselves. That's why a moral imperative, that's why moral leadership is desperately needed in this moment.
Forrest Whitaker, on how hopeful you are, you who've been working from the grassroots, with the grassroots, within communities, trying to bring attention and help to those most underserved. Are you hopeful?
I mean, I would think that I could lose some hope in the sense that, like as Amir was talking about and Melinda were talking about, there's like 101 million kids who have been backwards in their education and their reading levels and stuff. So you think to yourself, if we're in a place where 119 million people are like reaching towards poverty right now, you think not. But as a person who's on the ground, who's watching people try to deal with poverty and deal with education, sees the hope that you can see from the youth and what they can do. What you can do with concerted effort and a belief system, the very small amount you can take to just change a course of someone's life. It's really powerful to know that it's possible. And I think together, all of us working together with the countries and everyone combined can make a big difference and take this horrific moment that's happened for us and turn it into something where the planet itself recognizes its connection with each other. Because now we can't say, I'm here and you're there and it doesn't affect us. That's not true. It's so clear. We're in this together and we have to work together to be able to change our planet for the better. And that's what this is offering us, a new opportunity, an opportunity for us to be bonded together.
And an opportunity for us, Wicker, for us also to address some of those more unseen consequences of this pandemic that are to do with mental health. And this is something your initiative has been very involved in.
Yeah, we decided to create a trauma program because it was really important as we were dealing with the youth, we would be able to see that they were struggling with being able to survive the issues that are going on. So we started to train trauma workers to go out into the communities, to be able to work with the community. And we've started to make it an integral part of all of our work and all of the work with our development and everything. There's an element of trauma training that goes on because I feel like there's a need almost within the world for a trauma core, a core that can go across and recognize the amount of trauma that people have gone through. That's why you have this gender-based violence that we're talking about and different things. These people have to be dealt with. They have their heart and their minds have to be touched, and acknowledged for the pains that they've gone through, the isolation, the quarantines, the loss of lives. All of these things are trauma. And we have to be able to deal with it. And as a result, we made it a deep, important part of the next phase of our continued growth as we observe what's happening with humanity.
Mayor Lukwago, perhaps to you briefly before we bring the session to an end, what more does the world need to be doing? What more does the North need to be doing for the global South? How much does the world need to change still?
Well, first and foremost, I appreciate the concerns raised by the panelists about bridging that gap and address this inequity, because we really need to build a more inclusive and equitable world. I liked the observation made by my brother there that the global North is failing the global South, to the extent that even vaccines manufactured in South Africa had to first go to Europe. That is very, very unfair. COVAX, for example, has not been so much helpful to us. I think using the platforms like I've talked about, probably we can talk about quota systems and say this quota goes to this particular part of the world, and we know what we are entitled to. Of course, Kampala, Uganda, and many African countries couldn't finance the innovations. They didn't have the capacity. But now priority was being given to those who financed, and then priority also given to those who have booked earlier. And for us, we are just receiving a donation. I'll tell you, for example, something very, very interesting and amazing. As we talk right now, all we have are just donations, and they are very, very few. We are being told time and again by our own national government that we have appropriated funds to purchase our own vaccines. But on the world market, there isn't anywhere. Go to India, go wherever, already booked. They also have their domestic problems. I think we need to break those barriers. In the spirit of the Paris Forum, the Peace Forum, These are some of the critical issues we need to do, and we need to widen the scope of all these agencies we have as we build a network, because for us, we believe in network building. That's why, for me, as a founding member of the Mayors Migration Council, I'm very, very proud of the initiatives so far taken in building those synergies and also coming up with those inclusive arrangements. I think we can build on that and come up with wider networks that can ensure that at least there is fairness when it comes to distribution of the vaccines.
Perhaps to each of you, very briefly, that idea that what are needed is a network. Our network, when you think about it, the global international political infrastructure is perhaps not up to the challenge that we're talking about today. There are, of course, private initiatives that fill crucial gaps, and all of you represent those. How important is that network building at this point, Melinda?
A global network is imperative. And I think we're here on Armistice Day in Paris. And, after World War I and then World War II, the world came together and said, never again. Never are we going to have a world war. And we built certain organizations. The United Nations was built, and many different parts of the United Nations that exist. The World Health Organization. COVAX was stood up during a pandemic. It's far from perfect. It has failed the Global South. But we need to build on that so that everybody buys vaccines equitably through a system like that. And it takes all partners. It takes grassroots organizations, foundations, government, private sector to actually create the innovations. But if we work together, we can prepare for another pandemic so we don't have to close all of our economies.
Forrest Whitaker, your final thoughts on the question of that networking, the fact that this pandemic could actually finally bring the world together in ways that are constructive.
This is what I believe. I think that we have to look at a situation and see where is the positive that's happening. And what's happening is bringing people together to find their own structures, their own purposes together. And I think that that's an important aspect. Every time we go into work in any particular place, we start to make partnerships. Partnerships are the first thing that have to happen to be able to be on the ground and respect each other. And from those partnerships, we can go out and grow. And I think that when this is the partnership of mankind, or womankind. This is a partnership where all of us have to come together. You working towards your vaccines, you working towards your financial inclusion, me working on the ground with other youths, all of us coming together to solve a national problem. And that national problem won't happen again if we all come together now. We may be able to stop it. We maybe have a mechanism that lets us do it for the future. Being optimistic, being someone who believes that together we can change things and together we can make things happen.
Darren Walker, it's an imperative, not a question.
It is an imperative, and I am hopeful that the networks and the collective action, the call to action can be mobilized. As a foundation, I think about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said about philanthropy in 1968. He said the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And what Dr. King was saying is that the work of philanthropy is not only charity and generosity, but it must be justice and dignity. And in this network of global actors, we in the North have to reconsider how we have designed a system that subordinates the people who are closest and most proximate to the very challenges. And in order to be effective and really solve these problems, these global challenges, we are going to need to listen. We're going to need to give credibility to the voices, the lived experiences of people who are closest to the challenges. And we're going to need to think about the systemic ways in which we need to redesign this system so that people truly have dignity.
Darren Walker, thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Mayor Lukwago from a distance in Kampala, Melinda French-Gates at last in person in Paris. We're delighted, Forrest Whitaker as well. Pleasure to meet you all. Darren Walker, thank you so much all for taking part. In about 20 minutes' time, it'll be time for the official opening ceremony of the Paris Peace Forum, the 4th edition, of course, and we'll join you all in just a moment for that. Thank you.